Well, I was thinking this week, one thing that I just love, I love a great story. Do you like a great story? I mean, it can be a story through a movie or in a book or even in theater. A great story is a great story, no matter what the medium is, isn't it? And really, the best stories, I especially love stories that are based on real life. Sometimes you see the movie and it says based on a true story. I'm always like, man, that's cool. I really want to see this because it's true. And it's interesting because, you know what? All great stories, they really share some key elements, but particularly all great stories share one key element that's common in all great stories. And do you know what that common element is? Conflict. A great story contains conflict. For example, the true story depicted in the movie Chariots of Fire. Everything's going along, but then conflict arises, right? When Eric Liddell learns that the race that he's going to run in the Olympics, that he's trained most of his life for, is going to be on a Sunday. And as a follower of Christ and a devout follower of Christ, he can't run on Sunday. That's conflict. In a book, Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, there's many sources of conflict in that story as Santiago goes out, right? The first point of conflict, he's out there by himself and he hooks this great fish. How is he going to ever land it? And then once he lands it, he has conflict on saying, how am I going to get it back to shore through storms and sharks trying to attack this? How does this happen? And it makes for a great story. You see, great stories all have conflict. Now, the best author of great stories ever, especially true ones, is God himself. Do you know that? And Scripture contains a lot of these great stories, including this story of deliverance that we find in the book of Exodus. So why don't you, if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Exodus chapter 1. We're continuing a series that we started last week through the book of Exodus and following a faithful God. And we're right in the middle of chapter 1. But as we began that series, right, we looked at last week how this, the Israelites, right, these descendants from Abraham and children of promise, how they got to live in Egypt and how God blessed them and how he brought them there and took care of them and honored his promise. And through this, these Israelites, or as they're called a lot in this passage, the Hebrews, grew from the 70 people who first came into a great multitude of people. It says at the end of verse 7, where we left off last week, that God richly blessed them and they multiplied, right? And they grew. But conflict does arise even in this, And here's an interesting truth, as we're going to see today, we learn often that even when we face conflict in our own lives, that when conflict arises, sometimes God uses conflict to move us in following him. Do you know that? Sometimes God uses things that come along that shake us so that we look to him, we drop what we're doing, and we move where he's leading. And that's true today in what begins to happen, because what happens with the Israelites living in Egypt is conflict arises as they're living in Egypt. So we're going to pick up in verse 8. And what I want to do is I just want to read through the rest of chapter 1, and then we're going to go back because we're going to read through it and you're going to go, what? And then we're going to kind of dive back in and we're going to kind of seek to understand it. Because there's a lot here this morning, and I'm giving you this warning ahead of time, that there's going to be a lot here, and I'm sure you're going to have questions, and we're going to go back and we're going to look at it all as we go through, because this is really interesting how this conflict arises, and it seems to come out of and just say, how can this happen? So, verse 8, Exodus chapter 1. Here's how it comes. Now, there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for the Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So ruthlessly they made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Wow. This is certainly a change from what we read last week, isn't it? They come to Egypt and God blesses them and they're together and they're in the greatest part of the land, the richest part of the land. And then this happens. Talk about conflict, right? I mean, what we just read, it's horrifying, isn't it? It's gruesome. Just awful. Yet, you know what? At the same time, in a way, there's something a little beautiful in this. And really, this conflict that we see and the intensity of conflict that's in this passage, you know, it's not isolated. This isn't the only time there's ever been conflict in the world history, or this sort of brutality that was brought against the people here in Israel. It's happened. It's almost cyclical that it happens in our human history. In fact, although we might not be facing these specific actions against us, as followers of Jesus, you know what? We do face and we will face conflict that is shocking in its intensity, just like this is. And I'm sure as we kind of read through this, I don't know about you, you might have some questions on what we just read. I know as I read this, I said, what? No! Why? What? And you start asking yourself all these questions, saying, how can God allow this to happen? What did I just read? What does it mean? And I don't know. Did anybody have those questions? And as I had them, you start to look at it, and you know what? Even after studying it, I still have a few questions, and it's okay to still have some questions that we don't know all the answers to. But what I want to do this morning is I want to kind of dig back into this passage. Try to make sense of it, better understand, find some answers to what's happening here so we can make sense of this in the grand scheme of a faithful God that we're looking at in this story of Exodus. And I'm confident that when we do kind of dig into this, we're going to discover that in the midst of conflict, you know what, and even conflict we face in our own lives, we're going to discover that God is faithful. Even in the midst of awful things happening. And best of all, that God is worth following. So let's kind of dive in, and we're going to kind of go through verse by verse. And it's going to take a little time, and I'll just kind of give that caveat as we go through this. But I think it's important that we kind of set this stage because, again, conflict is so important to a great story. And we need to understand really what this conflict is all about. So, verse 8. And verse 8 is where this conflict is introduced. And it's a really key verse because of what it says. It's not a long verse, but what it says is huge. It says, a new Pharaoh comes to power, and he doesn't know Joseph. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that he never heard of Joseph. I mean, Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt. And even though it's about 300 to 350 years past that point, you still learn history. And Joseph was a key person because, he was this slave in prison who turned into the prime minister and not only saved Egypt, but he brought his whole family then to come and live in the best part of the land. Now it's interesting here. So he kind of knows who he is. But who is this Pharaoh that it's talking about? Did you notice this Pharaoh is not named? I don't know about you, but sometimes that bugs me when there's no resolution there. And Pharaoh's not named. And there's a very important reason why Pharaoh's not named, and it's very interesting, and we're going to get to that in a bit. But one of the things of people then trying to say, well, I want to know what Pharaoh this is, and one of the reasons why it can be difficult is because we're not really sure of the exact date that all these events of Exodus happened. In fact, there's two great theories out there. There's an early date for Exodus, which means the Israelites left Egypt in the year 1446 BC. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And then there's some who believe, no, it was a later date, around 1290 BC that this happened. And they look at all the dates and they try to reconstruct everything. But there's a couple of key verses, and we don't have time to go into it now, that if you take the Bible more literally, you're going to come to that earlier date of 1446. So that's where I kind of lean, and that's where most scholars kind of lean on the date of the Exodus is 1446. And if you do that, then you can kind of say, well, it could be one of two pharaohs then, if you're placing this kind of here. But that's not important. God doesn't name him. And if God doesn't name something, his name's not important. So just to kind of get there and understand there, to kind of have that resolution and as we go through this. But anyway, the point here is not Pharaoh's name. The point is that this Pharaoh who raises the power doesn't know Joseph. And again, he's had to hear of him, so he's like, Joseph, I've never heard that name before. What it's talking about with doesn't know Joseph is he doesn't recognize the importance of Joseph, and especially the importance of Joseph in the relationship to all of these Israelites or Hebrews that are now living in Egypt. He can say, well, yeah, I know Joseph was important and he saved Egypt. In fact, Joseph is the reason why at this time Egypt is the most powerful nation in the entire world at this point. And this Pharaoh is the most powerful leader of the most powerful nation. Because it was when Joseph came in during the famine that Egypt was the only nation in the whole world that wasn't experiencing a famine, and everybody came to them for food, so they sold all the food and got rich, and they gained influence and all of these things. That was because of Joseph. So what this Pharaoh is kind of saying is, yeah, I understand Joseph's important, but why do his descendants 300 years later have to be important? I mean, they're just a people group. So that's kind of the idea here, is he's not recognizing them as important or as significant. Now this is interesting because he's misunderstanding his history, right? He's looking back. And bad things happen when we forget or we misunderstand history. Do you know that? When you forget history or you misunderstand it or you twist it into what you think it should be, guess what happens? Bad things happen. We see that happening in our country today. And that's why some people are like, no, we have to hold on to history, whether it's good or bad, and sometimes it's bad and it's ugly, but we need that because it helps anchor us. And if you don't have that anchor, you forget why you do things. This is what's happening with this Pharaoh. Bad stuff can happen. In fact, we see the bad stuff start to happen in the next couple verses. Verses 9 and 10, it says, because of all of this, he sees this once, small family of 70 people growing into a huge people group. In fact, by the time they leave Egypt, there's 650,000 men. So over 1 million. Less at this point, but still a lot. And you know what happens? He gets afraid. He says, uh-oh, that's a threat to my power. Now, this is a baseless threat that he feels. This is all in his head. Because as we know, and as history even speaks of, the Hebrew people living in Egypt never showed themselves as anything but good citizens. We never hear of things like they were rebellious people, they were a violent people, they wanted to overthrow and all these kinds of things. They weren't trouble there. They were living peacefully in the land. So they were showing no hindrance or no idea that they were bad, except the fact that there were a lot of them. A whole lot of them. So this Pharaoh says, uh-oh, they outnumber us. And in his own head, he starts to feel insecure and starts to feel worried about it and says, we need to do something about it. So what does he do? Verse 9 and 10, he says, let us deal shrewdly with them. Okay? Do you know what this means? He says, first step, we're going to use our political savvy in massaging things to kind of make them miserable. Okay, so first, he uses political savvy. If you ever want to take a people down, this is where it begins, on the political realm, right? So what does he do? He decides then, politically, I'm going to afflict them. Afflict them with more burden. And the idea behind this is I'm going to put them to work, and that's going to do a couple things. One, it's going to make them tired so that they could never raise up because they're going to be too worn out. But also, they're going to be too worn out even to make new babies. They're going to come home after a long day and say, I just want to go to bed. So it's going to slow this population rise of the Israelites. So that's kind of the thinking behind what he's doing. So he says, I'm going to put them to work. And I'm going to put them to work for Egypt's benefits. And he has them build these storehouses for wealth in these two cities. Okay? Notice this. The Israelites, we see in some movies and things like this, the Israelites as slaves, they're building the pyramids. The Israelites did not build the pyramids. The pyramids are built with huge stones. It says in our passage that the Israelites were making bricks. Bricks make buildings, not pyramids. So they're not working for monuments. They're working to build the infrastructure of Egypt, okay, or for the benefit of Egypt. So they're not only taking the people down and making them tired, but they're benefiting from them. So that's shrewd, isn't it? It's savvy, and that's what the Pharaoh here is doing. Despite all this hardship, though, God is faithful. Because it said, and he's faithful in this way. What was part of the promise he gave to Abraham? I'm going to make of you a great nation. You're going to have descendants that outnumber the stars in the sky, right? So what is God doing? He's exploding the growth. It says actually they multiplied people. So it had the exact opposite effect of what Pharaoh wanted. And this is something interesting to trace through the book of Exodus, especially the story of the Exodus in the first part of the book of Exodus, about this Pharaoh and the pharaohs that follow them. That's kind of ironic. Everything they try to do to oppress God's people, the exact opposite ends up happening. Do you know that? And here we see the first of it. He says, well, I'm going to oppress them so they're miserable, and so they can't have kids. And what happens? They're blessed and they're multiplying. Well, that didn't work. So we get to verse 13, and it goes to the next level. You know what the next level is? Outright oppression. Outright oppression. You see, evil against the people always takes this route. We can look in history. The Roman Empire, this is how it started. It started politically, and that's how they rose to power politically. Then they said, all right, now we have to start thinning the herd so we can have more power, so they started to afflict certain people, and then they started to oppress them or put them under their foot so that they could have power. It happened in Roman Empire. It happened with Hitler. He rose politically first. Lenin rose politically first. You know, Mao in China. All of this political advancement gains power. It's increased through affliction and becomes entrenched through oppression. And this is what's happening here. We even see this happening in our day today, don't we? Not only in our world, but in our country, we can see some of this happening and turning to oppression. Anyway, this doesn't work. So he makes them slaves and is ruthless to them, but God is faithful. Okay? God is faithful in all of this, and the people still grow. So now Pharaoh takes it to the next level. The next level of evil is this: trying to control life and death. Look what he does in verse 15. He uses the Hebrew midwives. Okay, the midwives, these are Hebrew women who help with the birthing of babies. It's interesting about these Hebrew midwives. They were generally younger, single. They didn't have families of their own. And they were used to help Hebrew women give birth. And he brings in these Hebrew women, and he names two of them that he brings in, Shiphrah and Puah, which is interesting that they're named, and we're going to get into that in just a minute because it's kind of cool. He brings them in, though, and he says, here's what I want you to do. As you come to somebody's house and they're giving birth, as you're helping deliver this baby, as it's coming out, you see it's a boy, you need to kill it. If it's a girl, you can let it live. And once the baby's out and it's born and it's washed up and everything, they can't really touch it. That's murder. But if she's still giving birth and that happens, you need to kill it. That's outright abortion, right? And we see this, and it's murder, yeah, and it's gruesome, right? And it's as evil as abortion. It's just plain evil. That's what's happening. But he tells them, I need you to do that. Now, there's a couple questions that may arise with you today as you read this, and you say, why is he just wanting to kill the boys and not the girls? Seems rather sexist, doesn't it? What's the deal with this? Well, let's dig into that. It was sexist. See, the world at that time was pretty sexist. In fact, men were looked at as the ones who brought society into the next level. They were a benefit to society. They were the brave ones. They were the strong ones. They were the dangerous ones. They were the ones that got out there and got stuff accomplished. A woman, she was an object, a thing. She didn't have any rights in the society or anything like that. Do you know what they were looked for as an object? Almost like livestock. Here's what they're good for. They're good for cooking, keeping the house, for sex, and for having babies. That's pretty much all they're good for. So Pharaoh's like, so men are dangerous, let's get rid of the men. But really what's behind this is mass genocide to remove a whole people's group. Because here's how it works out. Remember, in the ancient world, the family line or lineage, so even your racial and cultural lineage, would go through the line of the father. So if you're Hebrew, and your father's Hebrew, then you're Hebrew. So here's the thinking. You kill all the men, and then the women you can sell off as slaves and sell off to get married to Egyptian men. So when they have a baby, it's not going to be Hebrew, it's going to be Egyptian. So after a generation or so, guess what happens? There's no more Hebrews. There's no more Israelites. There's no more of God's people. So he's wiping out. This is mass genocide that's happening here. And make no mistake, this is the work of Satan. Satan is running the show behind Pharaoh here. Because this is the desire of Satan. I want to take out God's people. Because Satan knows through the line of God's people, through these children of Abraham, will come the Messiah. So if I can cut it off here, it won't happen. So here's what Pharaoh decides. And he says, we're going to have this, and I want you, Hebrew midwives, to kill these baby boys as they come out. Pure evil. Evil at its core as it's intensified. Okay? And again, this evil intensifies in all of this, of wiping out people groups. And we see this in history, don't we? We see it with the Nazis trying to wipe out a whole people group. We see it in Rwanda. We see it in China today. You know, and we see it through the evil of abortion in our own country. We see this as massive, wiping out entire generations. And it's just pure evil. Well, guess what? It doesn't work. Do you know why it doesn't work? Because God is faithful. And again, the irony here is how God works. Like how everything the Pharaoh does to push the Israelites down just lifts them up. And this is the time where it's kind of good to remember something. Remember, we just talked about men. This is all about men in the society of the day. The men are the important. They're the brave ones. They're courageous. They're powerful. They're mighty. They're dangerous ones. We have to do something about the men. Look here in this passage, and the next couple weeks, through the first couple chapters of Exodus, when the whole foundation of Exodus is laid, do you know who the heroes are? Women. You have these two women in the Hebrew midwives. You have Moses' mother, as we're going to discover in a couple weeks, his sister, his aunt, and even Pharaoh's daughter God uses as heroes for raising up the salvation or the rescue of God's people. Talk about irony. Isn't that cool? You know what that tells us? You know what that teaches us? God can use anybody. Never think you're nobody with God. Never think, well, other people have greater talents. Other people are successful. No, other people can. I can't do this. Guess what? God can do it through you. He can do it through anybody. Even the people that are thought the lowliest in society. Guess what? God says, I'm faithful. I'll do it through them. And that's what he does here. So he uses this, and he uses these midwives right where they are, doing what they're doing, to work for God. Again, these are single women. Some of you may be single or know people that are single, and they say, well, I really can't do anything for God. I need to get married and have a family, and then we're really going to start serving. These people served right where they were as single women and followed God. Followed this faithful God. Anyway, Pharaoh finds out that what he ordered isn't happening. The Hebrew little boys aren't getting killed. So he calls in these two midwives. And he says to them, why isn't this happening? Why isn't what I ordered you to do being done? And they tell him something pretty shocking. They say, well, the Hebrew women, they're not like Egyptian women. I mean, they just shoot these babies out so fast, we can't even get there. We find out somebody's having a baby, we're making our way to their house to go help deliver it. It's already delivered. We can't do anything about it at that point. Now, by going to Pharaoh, they're risking their lives here. They could get killed for saying this. And a big question kind of remains, and it's an ethical question. Are they lying here? They may be. It may be true. We're not told here. So this whole ethical question that we can ask, that we can debate for years, we can debate later. In our message, we're not going to debate it right now, because God doesn't say if it's true or a lie. All he says is, this is what happened, and that's not as important as what God does. Okay? Because we can debate that. Just like missionaries who smuggle Bibles in and they're being deceptive, or, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was implicated on the plot to kill Hitler, assassinate Hitler. And you're like, how can a great man of God do that? Isn't that wrong? Yes. And it could be no. We're not sure. So are they lying? Are they being deceptive? Maybe. But yet God's in control here. Okay? So anyway, these women come and they do this. Now, we get back to the name of Pharaoh, because this is interesting. Pharaoh. We never know the name of Pharaoh. The most powerful man in all the world, and what he does to build his country, his nation, his empire of Egypt. His name is not mentioned in all of this to go down in history as significant. Isn't that interesting? The most powerful man of the world. Do you know who is named that goes down in history? Shiphrah and Puah. Two lowly midwives are named. Pharaoh's not. Oh, that's pretty big, isn't it? Why is that? Because God's making a point here. There's something more important about these two women than about Pharaoh. And what is it? It says here, because they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They feared God. They respected him. They wanted to honor him with what they did, even if it meant their life. What a witness, huh? God is faithful. Now, what we do know that happens next is that God did bless these women. They didn't do it to get God's blessing. They didn't know God was going to bless them. They thought even going before Pharaoh, they would probably be killed, but they did it anyway. But it says because they feared God rather than man, God blessed them. He dealt well with them in the next couple verses, right? In fact, he gives them families to boot. Which is interesting because they're not being a part of the population reduction law of Pharaoh. Rather, God gives them families, so then the population keeps increasing. Again, pretty ironic, isn't it? Pretty huge. So, Pharaoh fails again. So, the last verse that we read, Pharaoh ramps it up even more. See, everything he's done up until this point has kind of been back in the shadows. He's been directing stuff. But really, you could say, he's got other people doing his dirty work, and he's can still wipe his hands of this. But now he's so frustrated, he's so angry at this, he's so afraid by this and desperate. Now he makes his evil known publicly, and he says, this is the part that I'm supposed to whisper, but I'm saying it out loud. These kids, these Israelites need to die. So all Egyptian citizens, I'm giving you an order. if you see a Hebrew baby boy, you not only have permission, you have the obligation, the responsibility to take it, throw it in the Nile River so it dies. Whew. That's big. The Nile River for the Egyptians, that was the life force for their whole country. A life flowed through that. And now he says, make it a place of death for these Israelites. And you're going to throw them in there. I mean, imagine this horror. And we kind of read through this and we're like, yeah, that's pretty bad. No, imagine this horror for the Israelites having to face this. You're a young Hebrew mom. You have a baby boy. He's beautiful. He starts to grow up a little bit and you have this. He's the apple of your eye. What you always wanted. What you dreamed for. And you have this baby boy and you're so proud of him. And one day you say, you know what, I need to go down to the shop, right? I need to get some shopping done. So you take your little baby boy and you go shopping. As you're at the supermarket, you notice there's an Egyptian woman. She's a rather nice-looking Egyptian woman, and she's coming up to you. Oh, she probably wants to say how cute your baby is. But instead, she comes up to you and grabs this baby and says, oh, no, don't fight this. I have permission. Actually, I have the responsibility to take this baby and to kill it. And she grabs the baby out of your arms and goes and throws him in the Nile. That's what's going on here. Imagine the horror. It's pretty serious, isn't it? It's pure evil. I mean, we can draw some parallels to what we see happening around us with control and controlling children, some of these things. But as an event here, it's just plain evil. And maybe we have the question, how can God allow this to happen? How can a loving God allow this? I know when I read this, I said, God, how can you do this? And real quick, here's my answer. It's 3 simple words. Of all my years of study and all resources I looked at, I don't know. I don't know how God can allow it, but I know that He's faithful and I know that He's good. And you know what? Sometimes it's okay to have doubts of what God does. It's okay to have questions, especially when we take them to God. Because do you know what happens when we take our questions and our doubts to God? Over and over again in Scripture, we see great men of God doing that with Jeremiah and David in the Psalms and all these people. And they go to God. And you know what God does? He doesn't always give them answers. But you know what He does? He says, I'm with you. And I'm good. And I love you. One day you'll get it. So it's okay to have doubts, and it's okay to say, I don't know, but I still can trust that God is good, and God is in control. And why He would allow this to happen? He's getting His purposes accomplished. So, I can rest in that. So we get to understand. And we're not told how this last order goes, whether it was successful or not. And we say, did any of these babies get killed? Undoubtedly, yes. Some Hebrew baby boys were probably killed. But what we do know that happens from this, and this is a little sneak peek in a couple weeks when we go to the next chapter, is that it's under this law to kill all the baby boys that a small Hebrew boy is placed into the Nile River. But yet they're rescued from the Nile River, raised by Pharaoh's daughter, and he is the one that God uses to rescue His people. His name was Moses. And we're going to find that out next week. But it's awesome, isn't it? Because it's about God's faithfulness, even in the midst of this. So that's why we call this passage, it's a horrible passage, but it's a beautiful passage. Horrible in the evil attempted against God's people, but beautiful because God shows Himself faithful over and over again, and faithful to His promises. See, part of the promise He gave to Abraham, He says, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. We're going to find out how that plays out in the rest of Exodus. But God is faithful to His promises. In fact, it's through this faithfulness in this conflict that we learn how we can even be encouraged today as we follow God, so that we can follow God more faithfully in conflicts that we face, and opposition and challenges that we may face in our lives today. You see, as we kind of look at this passage, and try to understand it in light of our world today, here's what we find. That God's faithfulness, right in the midst of conflict, it reminds us of several things that are going to lift us up. First of all, it reminds us, God's faithfulness in the midst of conflict reminds us that this world is not our home. Do you know that? This world is not our home. We see this with the Israelites. Egypt was not their home. They went to Egypt for a period of time. They got comfortable there. But God's promise not only included multiplying them into a great nation, but also to bring them to their promised land. That was their home. Last month we had a message on suffering well. Do you remember that message? And in suffering well, we found a truth that Jesus shared in John, where he said, in this world you will have trouble. Remember when he said that? And he said, but behold, I have overcome this world. But in this world we will have trouble. We will have conflict. We will face things. And that's thousands of years after this happened. It's always going to be the case. Because you know why? We live in a fallen world. We live in a world where sin is present. But you know what? It is not our home. We have another home as followers of Jesus, as ones trusting in Jesus. I always like to tell my kids this. We should never be surprised when sinners sin. Do you know that? Sometimes we get shocked when a sinner sins. It's what they do. When we were sinners, that's what we did. We did it well. We shouldn't be surprised when sinners sin. We shouldn't be surprised when we live in a fallen world as followers of Jesus that we face opposition, that we face conflict. We shouldn't be surprised at that. Why? Because we live in a fallen world. Sin is present. This is not our home. Satan wants nothing more than to take us down, to make us lose heart, to make us walk away from God, or try to walk away from God. Our lives here on this earth will never be easy and trouble-free. If we haven't experienced that now, we will. But we can be encouraged because this life and this world, it's not the end-all be-all. There is more. We have another home. And we have another home, a place where there is no sickness, as Scripture tells us. There's no tears. There's no sin. A place where God himself dwells with his people. And it's a place where there is no end. In fact, Jesus told his followers about this place. In John chapter 14, he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Basically, be encouraged. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house, there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. See, he's describing heaven. That's our home. With God. We will go there. It is a guarantee. Jesus said it. He will do it. That is our home. So in our passage, God allowing this conflict to help move his people from comfort to the home of his promised land, through all they were experiencing, that's what God did. For us, it's us to realize, as we're trusting in Jesus alone, that this isn't our home. Yes, we're going to face trouble, but there's a home waiting for us in heaven. That is our home, and that is an eternal home. And you know what? What we face on this earth is a speck of what we will experience in God's presence for all eternity. It's like when you get your flu shot. It's just a little stick. In the grand scheme of your life, it feels like nothing. That's what this world is. And so much of our lives, we focus on trying to be happy here, trying to be comfortable. This isn't our home. So we can be encouraged of that God is faithful. He is preparing a home for us. And he's going to bring us home for all eternity with him. And this reminder should fill us with peace then, even in the midst of conflict. Rather than being filled with fear, worry, or anger when we're facing hardship, we can have peace to say, that's okay. I can endure this, because I know what awaits me. This world is not our home. And through this passage, God's faithfulness in conflict, in the midst of conflict, also reminds us of something else. And that's this. It's His approval that matters most. And Sifra and Pua, they remind us of this, don't they? Instead of being afraid of Pharaoh or living for his approval, his acceptance, they feared God rather than man. They wanted to please God rather than pleasing Pharaoh, even if it meant Pharaoh taking their life. You see, living for God's approval in a sinful world, it's risky. It's always risky. But just as when we choose to live for and stand in God's way rather than seeking acceptance and praise of others, we're going to find it's worth it. Because God is worth it. Because God alone is faithful. I was thinking about that, and I was saying, man, how much of my life have I spent in the past on worrying about the approval of other people, of trying to be successful in other people's eyes, to wanting to be liked, to wanting for people to say, man, he's kind of cool. Wow, I should listen to him. And how much time and effort we put into that. And yet it's gone. Why? Because it's God's approval that matters most. Who's man in that? One of my favorite Psalms is in Psalm 118. And the psalmist says, out of my distress, out of my conflict, out of my hardship, I cried out to the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. He encouraged me. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me compared to everything God does for me? And I think about that and I'm like, well, what can man do to me? Well, man can do a lot to us. They really can. I mean, they can make life painful and hard. Yet, God is bigger than all of that. Because He is with us. And He's so much greater than any trouble that it may bring our life in the temporary. In fact, when we seek God over man, we can face any conflict that ever comes our way with confidence rather than fear or insecurity. Because we know that we are loved, we are accepted by the only one that matters. Because His approval matters most. And then finally, one last thing as we kind of close out, and I know it's getting a little late. It's through Pharaoh's final command that we're reminded, because we see God's faithfulness in the midst of conflict, that His way is the right way to follow. He alone is worthy of our trust. I kind of put myself in the Hebrew shoes there in Egypt when all of this stuff is happening. I don't know that they blamed Pharaoh at the beginning of all of this. Because he was kind of hidden in it. So it was just coming down as kind of, it's the government kind of putting these things on us. And sure, okay, we have to work hard. We have to help with this. We have to do our fair share and contribute. I don't necessarily like it, but okay, we'll do it. And you know what? If it gets out of line, I'm sure Pharaoh, he's the most powerful man in the world, he can stop it if it goes too far. And then they may have even heard that the Hebrew midwives were supposed to kill the Hebrew baby boys, but they didn't really see it happening. So maybe they're just like, well, that's just a rumor. We live in Egypt. It's the most powerful nation in the world. And we have a leader. He's going to take care of us. And they could think that until one thing happens. All of a sudden, he comes out from the shadows and he proclaims to all the people, kill the Hebrew baby boys. Now they realize, wait a minute. This guy's not good. We can't count on him. He's pure evil. You know what? Sin is always going to be exposed. Do you know that? Sin in people's hearts, evil in people's hearts. You give it enough time, it'll be exposed. Don't trust in people. Sometimes we trust in that, and we're going to trust in government, or we're going to trust in a president, and we may say, well, as a Christian, if we just got a Christian president in there, he would make some real changes. No, he wouldn't. He probably wouldn't. We've had it. Because that's not the way, is to follow a man. It's to follow God. That's where we're supposed to put our trust in. So we kind of see this, right? And there's no longer any doubt with the Hebrews that Pharaoh is not good and he can't be trusted. They see the face of evil right in front of them. And they say, man, God's our only hope. You see, and through God's faithfulness in conflict, that's what God shows himself. All of a sudden, it gets to be this dividing line. And you say, now I realize what is good and what is right and what is not. We're seeing that in our world today. There's a dividing line coming on who a true follower of Jesus really is and who isn't. Can't we see that today? Over and over again. See, because it always finds itself out. And God's way is the only right way to follow. You know, in Proverbs, it says that. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Don't try to think you can figure this out. Rather, acknowledge God. Seek Him. And He's going to make your path straight. Or He's going to show you the right way. And that held true for the Hebrews, but it holds true for us today. And we find God faithful. You see, and when God shows Himself faithful, that He is the way, you know what it gives us? It gives us clarity. Clarity rather than confusion when living in a sinful world. Well, do I choose this? Do I choose this? You know, we choose God. And as God shows Himself faithful, we see that line. And we know that God alone offers true salvation. You see, in life, conflict happens. It's a guarantee. We live in a sinful world. Evil sometimes will seem to triumph. And we'll see it around us. We'll see it happen to us. It happened back to God's people, the Hebrews, back in Egypt. And it happens to God's people today. Oftentimes, this conflict, it can derail us. It can distract us. It can demoralize us as we try to deal with it maybe in our own strength, in our own way. Yet when we trust that God is faithful, even in the midst of our conflict, you know what happens? We now can start to face this conflict through Him with uncommon peace, as we're reminded that this world is not our home, with unshakable confidence, as we're reminded that it's God's approval that matters, and His approval matters most, and with unmatched clarity, as we're reminded that God's way is the right way to follow. You know, we're living out a great story. God has a great story that He's living out through us. And as any great story, it includes conflict. Conflict and hardship, though, do not need to defeat us, because we have a God who loves us and a God who is with us. And most of all, we have a God who's faithful. He's going to accomplish His plans in and through us in the midst of any hardship we could ever face. And because of that, we can follow a faithful God through any conflict. And that's what we learned today from a pretty gruesome but beautiful passage in this story, this great story of Exodus. Let's pray.